Have you ever stopped to wonder why money can make us feel so deeply, sometimes hopeful, sometimes terrified, sometimes even ashamed? Why it seems to reach right into our stomachs, twisting them with fear or giddiness, all based on a few digits in a bank app? Why is it that two people can walk out of college, land similar jobs, earn nearly identical paychecks for the next 30 years, and yet end up with completely different lives? One is anxious, constantly juggling bills, dreaming of that mythical someday when I finally feel secure. The other, calm, deliberate, unshakable, not flashy, but quietly building a life on their own terms. Or why is it that you hear stories of lottery winners who, after a glorious couple of years filled with yachts and champagne, end up more broke and more miserable than they were before? While someone else, maybe a janitor or a mailman, who never seemed particularly ambitious, dies and surprises everyone by leaving millions to a local school or hospital? It almost feels like money plays by rules we don't fully understand, like it dances to some hidden music. No matter how many Excel spreadsheets we build or how many seven-step systems to wealth we try, there's something deeper, something stubbornly human steering the wheel. That's exactly what Morgan Housel explores in The Psychology of Money. And it's why this book has struck such a nerve around the world. Because it's not a book of tips. It's not even really a book about finance. It's a book about us, about the weird, tangled, wonderfully inconsistent psychology that shapes how we earn, spend, save, envy, compare, panic, and dream. So let's go on a journey together. Not a dry lesson, but a human one. Let me share with you some of the most powerful stories and insights from this book. The ones that made me stop mid-page, close my eyes and whisper, whoa, that's me. Morgan starts the book with this deceptively simple line, no one is crazy. And if you really let it sink in, it's almost a relief, isn't it? Because when it comes to money, it's so tempting to look around at our friends, our family, strangers, online, and judge. Why is your friend always splurging on the latest phone when he's drowning in debt? Why does your aunt hide cash under her mattress like it's 1943? Why does your coworker refuse to invest in stocks, terrified he'll lose it all? It might look ridiculous to us, but the truth is, to them, it probably makes perfect sense. Because every single financial decision someone makes is shaped by the unique, unrepeatable path they've walked in life. Imagine growing up in America in the 1950s. Your parents probably talked with awe about the booming stock market. Your whole young adulthood was surrounded by growth and optimism. Of course, stocks feel safe. Now imagine growing up in Japan in the early 1990s. You'd have come of age just as one of the biggest stock bubbles in history burst. Decades of stagnation followed. Entire families watched their savings evaporate. To you, stocks might feel like a reckless gamble, almost like a rigged casino. Or imagine if your grandparents lived through hyperinflation, where one day a loaf of bread cost 1 mark and the next day 100. Saving cash in a bank would feel insane to them. They'd say, buy gold, buy land, buy anything real. Even two siblings growing up in the same house might end up with completely different money attitudes. Maybe one got their first job during a booming economy, felt secure, learned to take risks. The other started working during a recession, saw layoffs everywhere, learned to be cautious, even fearful. So when we talk about money with someone, we're not just exchanging facts. We're bumping up against entire life stories, decades of memories, half-remembered lessons from parents and teachers, scars and joys and fears. That's why judging someone's financial choices rarely makes sense. Given their story, they might be doing exactly what feels safest and smartest to them. Now let's talk about two forces that shape every financial story, luck and risk. Morgan calls them siblings. They're invisible, hard to measure, easy to deny, and absolutely real. Take Bill Gates. Yes, he was brilliant, driven, a tireless worker, but he also happened to attend Lakeside School in Seattle, one of the very few high schools in the world in 1968 that had a computer terminal. Out of millions of kids worldwide, Gates landed in one of maybe a dozen schools that would give him thousands of hours of programming experience years before most universities even got computers. Without that stroke of luck, who knows? Maybe there is no Microsoft. Maybe Gates is just some smart lawyer in Seattle. And there's Kent Evans, Gates' close friend and probable business partner. Kent was every bit as smart and ambitious, but he died young in a mountaineering accident, pure, cruel chance. Same era, same school, same talent. Luck and risk pulled them in wildly different directions. Morgan puts it perfectly. Luck and risk are siblings. Both are reality, both are hard to measure, and both are easy to overlook. So it's wise to hold success and failure with humility. When we see someone wildly successful, we tend to say, wow, they must be so brilliant. When someone fails, we shake our heads. What a fool. But so often the difference was just a coin flip of fortune, a chance meeting, a market crash, a health crisis, a moment of perfect timing or terrible timing. One of the stories from the book that haunted me the most is about Rajat Gupta. Gupta was born into deep poverty in India, lost both parents young, but he was extraordinary. Clawed his way to the Indian Institute of Technology, then to Harvard Business School, eventually became CEO of McKinsey, one of the most respected consulting firms in the world. He had it all: reputation, a net worth over $100 million, a circle of friends that included Bill Gates himself. But it wasn't enough. Gupta wanted to be a billionaire, so he got involved in insider trading, chasing faster returns, and it all came crashing down. He went to prison, lost his reputation, lost everything. Morgan pairs this with the story of Ronald Read, a janitor and gas station attendant in Vermont. Read lived a simple life, quietly invested in blue-chip stocks, spent far less than he earned. When he died, he shocked his entire town by leaving $8 million to the local library and hospital. So here's the chilling question. Why risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need? It's so easy to think, I'll just get a little more, then I'll stop. But the goalpost keeps moving. It becomes a trap, one that can cost you not just money, but your peace, your relationships, even your integrity. So ask yourself, what's your enough? Because if you never draw that line, you'll run forever, maybe right off a cliff. If there's one idea that feels like honest-to-goodness magic, it's compounding. We all know Warren Buffett is rich because he's a phenomenal investor. But that's only half true. Buffett started investing at 10. He's now in his 90s. Almost all his massive fortune came after he turned 50. If Buffett had started at 30 or retired at 60, his net worth might still be impressive, but nowhere close to $100 billion. Morgan writes, good investing isn't necessarily about making perfect decisions. It's about consistently avoiding mistakes over a long period of time. It's like planting a tiny tree. For years, it barely grows. Then one year, almost overnight, it towers over everything. Most people never let compounding work long enough to see that magic. They pull their money out when the market dips. They chase the next shiny investment trend. They interrupt the process right when it's about to pay off. So if you want wealth to blossom, the real skill isn't picking the hottest stock. It's patience. It's staying the course year after year while the quiet math does its work. Here's a truth that hit me like a splash of cold water when I first read it. The mindset it takes to get rich is often the exact opposite of what it takes to stay rich. Getting rich usually means optimism. It means taking calculated risks, putting yourself out there, investing in ideas that might not work, trusting that the future will be brighter. It takes courage, even a little bravado. But staying rich, that's a completely different game. It requires humility. It means recognizing how much of your success was due to timing, luck, or forces you couldn't control. It means protecting what you've built. It's defensive, almost paranoid. Morgan tells the heartbreaking story of Jesse Livermore. Livermore was a legendary stock trader in the early 1900s. He famously made what would today be billions by shorting the market during the 1929 crash. Newspapers crowned him the Great Bear of Wall Street, but that same brilliance also bred arrogance. Livermore kept taking bigger, bolder bets, convinced he could never lose. Eventually, he did lose everything. Bankrupt and humiliated, he died by suicide. The lesson is painfully clear. Few gains are so great that they're worth risking your reputation, your family, or your freedom. So once you've built a good life, once you've hit your version of enough, it's okay to shift from offense to defense. Focus on preservation, respect uncertainty. Remember that sometimes the most radical act isn't doubling down. It's protecting what matters most. Now here's one of my absolute favorite ideas from the book. It's deceptively simple. You should save money even if you don't know what you're going to spend it on. That might sound obvious or even lazy. Aren't we supposed to set specific goals? Save for a house, save for college, save for a vacation. But here's the thing. Life doesn't follow your neat goals. It doesn't care about your spreadsheets. Maybe your dream job opens up across the country and you need money to relocate. Maybe you suddenly feel pulled to take a sabbatical and write a book, or volunteer, or care for a family member. Or maybe, not as fun, you lose your job or face a health scare. If all your savings were tied up in one narrow goal, or if you only saved for predictable milestones, you'd be trapped. But if you've been quietly building cash with no particular plan, you've bought yourself the most priceless gift of all: options. Morgan puts it beautifully. Savings without a spending goal gives you options and flexibility, the ability to wait, and the opportunity to pounce. I absolutely love that. The opportunity to pounce. Because sometimes the best opportunities don't wait. They don't give you 12 months to get your finances in order. They show up on Tuesday and you have to decide. So by saving just because, you're buying your future self freedom. You're telling yourself, hey, whatever comes up, I've got you. That's not laziness. That's strategic compassion for your future. This ties beautifully into another lesson from the book that honestly every high school kid should be taught on day one. The most important part of every plan is planning on your plan, not going according to plan. Read that again. Because we humans love certainty. We love the idea that if we just follow these 5 steps, we'll retire at 60 with exactly $2.4 million in the bank and live happily ever after. But the world doesn't care about your 8% projections. Markets crash, businesses fail, industries evaporate, health crises hit, governments change policies overnight. Morgan gives us a powerful metaphor. It's like wearing a helmet. Most days it feels like overkill. You bike around the park, wind in your hair, no danger in sight. Then one day, out of nowhere, a car runs a stop sign, and that helmet saves your life. Same with financial caution. That emergency fund, the diversified investments, the slightly conservative forecast, they might look boring, even silly in the good times. But the one time you hit a pothole, they could save your future. So ask yourself, where in your financial life are you assuming things will go perfectly? Where could a single unexpected shock wipe you out? It's not about being pessimistic. It's about building resilience, so you can keep playing the game, no matter what curveballs life throws. All right, let's tackle something a bit uncomfortable. The next time you scroll through Instagram and see someone posing in front of a Lamborghini or vacationing on a private island, remind yourself of this simple truth from Morgan. Wealth is what you don't see. That car, it only tells you how much money they spent. It tells you absolutely nothing about how much they have left. Maybe it was bought outright. Maybe it was leased with money they couldn't actually afford to part with. Maybe it's putting them one step closer to financial ruin. Meanwhile, your quiet neighbor driving a 12-year-old Toyota might have enough in the bank to retire tomorrow. Morgan shares a brilliant line that more people need to tattoo on their brains. Spending money to show people how much money you have is the fastest way to have less money. Real wealth is often silent. It's the money that stays invested, compounding quietly in the background. It's the sense of calm that comes from knowing if your job ended tomorrow, you'd be okay for months. It's the power to say no to toxic clients or yes to an unexpected adventure. So the next time you feel that pang of envy, that flicker of, man, I wish I had that car, that watch, that house, pause, because true wealth doesn't always glitter. Most of the time, it's invisible, and that's exactly why it's so powerful. Now, here's a fascinating bit of psychology that Morgan highlights, which honestly blew my mind. Researchers asked people of different ages 2 simple questions. How much have you changed in the past 10 years? How much do you think you'll change in the next 10? Almost everyone said they'd changed dramatically over the past decade, but almost everyone also believed they wouldn't change much going forward. This is called the end of history illusion. We humans tend to think who we are now is basically who we'll always be. But if you look back, you'll see the lie. At 15, you had different dreams, different tastes in music, probably even a different moral compass. At 25, you might have been convinced your career was everything, or that you'd never want kids, or that you'd live in the city forever. So what does this have to do with money? It means don't lock your entire financial life around the person you are today. Leave some room for the person you're going to become. Maybe today you're all about climbing the ladder, but at 40, you'll crave slowing down. Maybe you swear now you'll never settle down, but at 35, you might dream of a quiet cottage with a garden. So build in flexibility. Keep part of your investments accessible so you can pivot if life surprises you. Avoid tying up all your money in assets you can't touch without huge penalties. And above all, give your future self permission to change. All right, now we arrive at what I think is the beating heart of this entire book. Morgan writes, the highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. Not yachts, not private jets, not diamond watches or 10-bedroom mansions, just the power to control your time, to decide for yourself what your day looks like, to linger over coffee with someone you love without glancing nervously at the clock, to take a long walk on a Tuesday afternoon, to build something that excites you, to rest when your body says rest. This is profoundly different from what most of us are taught. We're shown wealth as a collection of things, but real wealth is autonomy. It's waking up and saying, I don't have to answer to anyone today if I don't want to. It's the freedom to walk away from a bad boss, to move to a quieter town, to start a nonprofit, or to spend 3 months learning to surf. And ironically, you can have all the outward symbols of wealth, the big house, the expensive car, and still have zero control over your time. In fact, sometimes those symbols trap you deeper, because now you have to keep earning at a frantic pace just to maintain them. So ask yourself, what would a day look like if you could truly do whatever you wanted? What simple joys would you bring back into your life? What stress would you cut out immediately? Because that, not a number in a bank, here's the real treasure. Let's slow down for a second. Take a deep breath. I want you to really sit with some questions that could change everything about how you approach money. What money beliefs did you inherit from your parents or community that maybe aren't serving you anymore? Were you taught that rich people are greedy, that money is hard to get, that it's shameful to want comfort? Where are you chasing more without even knowing why? Is it because you think it'll finally make you feel safe, or because you're trying to impress people who probably aren't even watching? How could you use your money right now to buy more time, more peace, more freedom, instead of just more stuff? These aren't easy questions. They might bring up uncomfortable truths, but they're also incredibly liberating, because once you see the old scripts running your money decisions, you can start rewriting them. Not for someone else's approval, not to keep up with a highlight reel on social media, but for you, for the life that actually lights you up inside. In the end, that's what makes The Psychology of Money so powerful. It isn't a finance book. It's a book about being human. It's about understanding why we feel envy, why we panic during market crashes, why we sabotage ourselves by chasing just a bit more, even if it costs us our health or our relationships. It's about humility, patience, compassion for ourselves and for others who are walking their own complicated money journeys. Because true wealth, it's not a number. It's the calm you feel when you realize you could handle a layoff. It's the quiet pride of helping a friend in crisis or donating anonymously to a cause that matters. It's the power to shape your days in a way that feels meaningful. So as we wrap up this ultra-long exploration, I want to leave you with this invitation. Pause. Take stock of your money life, not just the numbers, but the feelings. Where do you feel anxious? Where do you feel joy? Where do you feel stuck? Get clear on your enough. Decide what truly matters to you, not what Instagram says, not what your neighbors think. Draw your own finish line. Plan for uncertainty, not because you expect disaster, but because you want to stay in the game long enough for compounding of money, of skills, of relationships to do its quiet magic. Buy your freedom. Use your money to buy time, to protect your health, to deepen your connections. That's the highest form of wealth. Because at the end of your life, when you look back, it won't be the number in your bank account that defines your story. It'll be the mornings you lingered with someone you loved, the afternoons you spent building something that mattered, the nights you fell asleep content, knowing you lived on your own terms. And that's the most beautifully human, complicated, and tender psychology of all. If this resonated with you, give it a like or drop a comment with your own biggest money insight. And remember to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories and psychology behind the way we live.